Hi everyone, so it's a pleasure to be here, and this past day it's been amazing to hear so many of you, to see so many young people. I'm super inspired, and being here is always special because Chester Zoo actually gave me my first job in the field of science communication a few years back, so it's great to be here to present today. And if you've never heard of conservation optimism before, if you weren't in the workshop this morning or yesterday, we're a program from the University of Oxford, and we aim to empower everyone to act for nature. And so the way we do that is by shifting the narrative away from the doom and gloom, but also by making sure that underrepresented voices get a platform as well. And so you can check us online using the hashtag conservation optimism, and you'll find lots of stories of positive success, and it's always uplifting checking the hashtag, so I recommend it. And I like starting all my talks by asking you guys, do you feel optimistic about the future of nature? So raise your hand if you do feel optimistic. I know it's 2 weeks after COP, so this might influence the room, but raise your hand. I see one, I see two. A few, okay, there are a few optimistic in the room. Are a few people being neutral, or are all the rest pessimistic? So raise your hand if you're feeling pessimistic. Okay, it's quite balanced. I'm quite pleased to see. I have to say, I gave a workshop 2 days ago in a school, and it was teenagers aged 16 to 18 years old, and literally all of them raised their hands, said they had no hope for the future of nature, which was very sad. So I'm glad to see that we've got a bit more of a mixed audience. So I just wanted to start by talking a bit about the doom and gloom narrative. I'm sure we all come across these things in our work, in our everyday life. And so this headline, I think, sums it up quite nicely, quote unquote. It's from the New York Times Magazine, and the headline, it's from a few years ago, but it was, "The insect apocalypse is here." And then under it you had, "What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth?" And it's not just an American phenomenon. Like, we've seen that in the UK as well. You regularly get headlines about the number of species getting extinct. Recently, we've just had a report about the fact that if we don't stop the temperature rising, it's all going to be disaster. So very often we have this doom and gloom framing in the media, and it's something that I've not seen only in UK and American media, but also in French media and in other places as well. And so again, I have another question for you guys, before I move on. How do you feel when you're reading these types of headlines? So raise your hand if you feel empowered to act and to do something when you see these kind of headlines. I see a half a hand at the back. Yeah, in the middle. And so raise your hand if it makes you feel really disempowered and you just don't want to hear about it anymore. Yeah, we've got a lot more hands. Yeah.
That's why I'm in the middle of that.
That's fair. You can be in the middle. Being in the middle is okay. But one thing that is quite interesting is that very often people, sometimes, not necessarily very often, but sometimes people say, "Oh, it's the media. Journalists are the problem. They're the ones spinning it. They're the ones putting that negative spin. They want sensationalized headlines." But I think it's a bit simplistic to just put it all on the journalists. And I mean, I'm obviously biased because I've got a mixed background in both conservation science and in journalism. So I've got a bit of both sides. But what's actually quite interesting is it's not just in the media. So this is a graph from a paper that was published in 2019 by McAfee et al. And it shows you the use of positive versus negative words and how it's been evolving throughout the years. And so to give you a bit of an example, positive words are things like benefit, rejuvenate, success. Negative words are things like loss, degrade, threatened. But these are titles of scientific papers. They're not titles of stuff you find in the media. So it's kind of showing as well that even within the scientific community, we've had that kind of doom and gloom narrative coming, and you can see how the negative words have really dramatically increased. So, obviously the information ends up in the media and being consumed by all of us, but very often a journalist will take their facts from either a press release or a journalist, and so, or from a scientist, from someone that they're interviewing, from a conservation NGO. So we need to be a bit more aware of the way we're framing our messages as well, because it really impacts down the line of what the general publics hear about, and all of us here in this room, I'm sure we see the news headlines all the time. And the reason why at Conservation Optimism we're really trying to shift that narrative away is that, as we've seen, you've all said you're kind of like feeling disempowered, you don't want to hear about it when you see all these headlines. And that's something that we found is that people just end up switching off, and we've got this quote as well that says, truly scary information has a nasty tendency to get ignored because people don't want to learn about it or they don't want to think about it. And in my personal life as well, to give you a bit of context, when I finished my journalism degree, it was the year of both Brexit and the Trump election, and I can tell you that having to read the news for my degree was painful. So I kind of reached the point when I finished where I was like, you know what, I need a news break. Like, I'm not going to look at the news for the next few months. And that's what a lot of people are doing with the news about the environment. They're like, you know what, I'm just not going to check that section of the newspaper or the website. I'm just not going to read about it. But in the middle of that, it's not all doom and gloom. It's not just the negative side. We have seen a rise of optimism. And so Conservation Optimism was funded by Professor E.J. Milner-Gullen from the University of Oxford. It started in 2016-17, and it was meant to be a one-off event. So what it was meant to be was a conference bringing together artists, policymakers, scientists together, talking about what's working in conservation, giving people hope, making people feel better and sharing these stories. And part of it was actually in ZSL in London. It was linked with Earth Day. There were lots of things around it. And what happened is people just liked it so much that they kept using the hashtag even after the event. And so what happened is a community just grew by itself, basically. And then they reached the point where they're like, okay, people are really keen on this idea. They keep using the hashtag. They keep sharing these stories of optimism. We need someone to come in full time and make this a program. And so that's where I came in. But conservation optimism is not the only optimism movement. You also have, at some point, there was climate optimism, which we probably need at the moment with COP. There's also Earth optimism, which is based at the Smithsonian in the US, and they have an antenna in Cambridge. So it seemed that around that time, which again was also the time of the Trump election and the Brexit referendum, maybe had a bit of an impact on all of that. People were like, we need optimism, we need like positive stories. And so the rationale behind it is actually, the reason why we're pushing hope. And I want to be really clear here, very often the pushback on conservation optimism is people saying, you're just being blissfully optimistic, you're just pretending that everything is fine and everything is going to get better by itself. And I'm like, no, this is not what we're all about. Our rationale for conservation optimism is that we want to show people there are many challenges. There are so many wrong things with the planet at the moment, I can't say otherwise. But what we're saying is don't end your story on just the challenges. Don't leave people feeling like that's it. So what we're saying to people is actually bringing in solutions. What are people around the world doing to make it better? Or if things have failed, what can we learn from it? Because very often in science and in conservation, you don't talk about failures. It's like, oh, this thing hasn't worked, when we're just not going to talk about it at all. But there's so much we can learn from it. And so we really want to encourage people to share both these stories of successes and also learning from failures. And what's interesting is that in terms of the science, looking at optimism, is they found that individuals with an optimistic outlook, they routinely manage to maintain higher level of psychological well-being during times of stress. And so that's also, having that optimistic outlook can also be good for your mental health in that sense. And it helps people. They found that when people are in very stressful situation and they tend to have that optimistic outlook, they feel empowered to take action still, rather than just not do anything and feeling paralyzed. So that's something that is quite important for us. And also what's quite good is that we've started seeing this shift as well happening in the media. So, I've shown you some headlines that were doom and gloom, but I'm not saying all the media out there is all doom and gloom. As a journalist on the side of my job, I've been involved with a network called the Solutions Journalism Network. And what they do, they're based in the US, but they work all around the world. And they really encourage journalists to shift their mindset from reporting only on the problems to bringing in that solutions-based framework. And so we're seeing that push being brought in the environmental reporting as well, and that's something that I'm really passionate about as well. And so you can see here, in the UK, there's a great example of that, which is Positive News magazine. It's a magazine that you can buy in probably not everywhere you get your magazine, but there's quite a lot of places that have it on the shelves, and you can find it on their website as well. So, if you ever want some positive news about conservation of the environment, it's a great place to check as well. But there are many others. So I found out the other day that the Evening Standard has a whole section called The Optimist that has really great reporting as well in terms of what's working in nature and the environment. And even The Guardian has, I think it's The Guardian that has The Upside. So it's a whole section again that has more positive and solutions-based reporting. So that's all good, but how can we communicate the challenges in a way that empower people to act? And that's often a question that I'm being asked. So at Conservation Optimism, we have a network that organizations from all around the globe can just join. It's like you fill a form online, and if you have an organization, then you can be on board. And so what we do when they join is we ask them, we give them a survey, and we say, okay, we're Conservation Optimism, we want to support you, we've got this network of 150 organizations, what do you want from us? And very, very often in the survey, what comes up is like, we want to be optimistic, we want to do it, but we don't know where to start. How do we frame these messages in a different way? How do we kind of unlearn the way we're reporting on it? And so what we did a few years ago is that we teamed up with someone who is specialized in framing. So he is a framing expert called Ralph Underhill, and he works for the organization here at the bottom, Framing Matters. And what we said is, look, we are the optimistic ones. You have the expertise in like the comms and the framing. Can we put our brains together and organize a workshop with some of our members to kind of come up with a very actionable toolkit that will help people bring in more positive communication? And so that toolkit came out of this collaboration called the Positive Communication Toolkit. And as you can see, it's a guide to reframing conservation messages to empower action. And so the way that came to life is we organized a workshop. It was just before the pandemic hit, so we were still able to have in-person workshop. We had lots of our members in the UK coming in Oxford. We also had a few joining in virtually, which for the time was quite pioneering. And we put our brains together, and so Ralph gave a presentation about framing, about communication, about different communication traps. And then we really asked people who were in the room, okay, you work in conservation, you put out messages all the time. What are some examples from your real, your real life experience? And so all the examples that you can find in our toolkit are actual real life examples from our members. And so I'm going to give you like a very brief introduction to the toolkit right now, but I would advise, if you want the whole thing, if you go on our website, conservationoptimism.org, you will find it in our resources section. It's one of our most popular resources so far. I think it's got over 2,000 downloads already. And we've got it in English, Indonesia Bahasa, Spanish, and we're getting a Portuguese version hopefully very soon. So, download it, spread it, share it with people. Usually we get really good feedback on it, so it seems to be quite a useful piece of work for people. And so to start with, I just wanted to talk about, what is framing. I've been using the word and throwing it out for the past few minutes, but, if you've not really heard of that word before, don't really know what it means. So a frame is something that comes up in your brain pretty much automatically, and it can be brought up by so many different things. It can be a word that someone is saying, it can be an image you're saying, it can be a film, it can be a song, a smell, and basically that's why what's already in people's heads really matters from the start. To give you a concrete example, let's say we're talking about farmers, and you're a conservationist, and what you have in your head when you're saying farmers is industrialized farming, massive scale, really bad. That's what you want to convey. But then the person in front of you is like, oh, my uncle has a few chicken and a farm and, lots of space. And so you're not talking about the same thing at all, because the word is not bringing the same frames in both your heads. So sometimes it's really important to kind of get an idea of what people might already be thinking and adjust your language accordingly. Because, for example, in that case, what you might be better off saying is industrialized farming from the start. And then the person will be like, oh, okay, yeah, big scale farming, damaging. I get it. And here as well, I've got an example of two different types of framings. So we can see a sad koala here, and the text reads, due to the devastating bushfires that have destroyed much of Australia's nature reserves, koala are now considered functionally extinct. So pretty factual, but pretty doom and gloom. It's like, that's it, koalas are gone. And then on the other side, you've got the happy koalas, and the text reads, koalas have been hard hit by the Australian bushfires, and these conservationists are working to come up with a plan for how to help save them. And so you can see, just by slightly changing the sentence, it brings a completely different emotion in you. You feel quite depressed on the first one, feeling like that's it for koalas, whereas in the other one, you're like, oh, people are trying to save them. That's something. At least they're trying. We don't know if koala will be saved, but, there is something being done. And another really important thing when we're communicating about nature or conservation or any kind of environmental challenges as well is this idea of values and beliefs. And so here I've put a few examples from blogs we've published on conservation optimism to kind of give you an idea of what I mean by that. So values and beliefs, you've got a whole list in the toolkit. So again, go check it out if you want the full info. But it can be you have positive values or negative values. It can be stuff like fear, or it can be love. And what my advice is, you don't want to pick one forever, and that's your value, and everything you're going to communicate is going to be around it. You kind of want to pick and match and see what works depending on the context. But here, for example, we've got the value about empathy. So just making sure that it really resonates with people, showing that you can protect nature in a way that also is empathic to the rest of the world, and working on that. You can also, one thing that is very often used in conservation is the idea of the beauty of nature, reminding people of how beautiful nature is, and that can really, without throwing lots of info at them, sometimes it's just showing them how beautiful nature is, just to remind them of that power. And so here you've got a blog on inspiring mangrove conservation through visual storytelling, and they had beautiful photographs of mangroves. And it wasn't in your face pushing a specific message on how to protect mangrove. It was just to remind you hey, there's this incredible ecosystem, look how beautiful it is. And sometimes that's also important to do. And then at the end, you've got a value that is community, remembering that sometimes working in conservation, protecting nature, can be something that really brings the community together. And I think that's something that we've really seen this weekend, just talking to all of you and seeing how passionate we all are about nature and conserving nature, I think is always really inspiring. So community is it's a value that I quite like tapping into. And so now, if we go into the nitty-gritty of science communication, whenever you're thinking about doing any message, and I just want to put it out there as well. Sometimes people say, oh, but I'm not a science communicator, I don't do this type of things, I don't write press releases. Everyone in this room this weekend has been doing some kind of communication. You've all been talking to each other about nature, about what you're passionate about, and that's already communicating. It doesn't need to be in a written form. And so I think that's important to remember, that communication can be many different things. But what's important is, before creating any message or talking to someone or giving a talk like this one, is thinking about why you're doing this, who are you trying to reach, and then what do you want people to do as a result. And so you can summarize that as the objective, the audience, and the outcome. And here I'm going to use an example that is actually from Chester Zoo, because it's an example that works really well. So a few years ago, when I was working at Chester Zoo, Chester was trying to become the first sustainable palm oil city. And spoiler alert, they did, which was very exciting. And so that was the objective. They wanted restaurant owners and caterers to swap their palm oil product with sustainable palm oil product instead. And so they had said, we need X amount of restaurants to have done that shift to then become a sustainable palm oil city. And so the audience in that case was very clear. They were like, we need to reach out to restaurant owners. They're our audience. They're who we're trying to reach out to. And you need to know a few things about your audience. And so in that case, it was the timing of the meetings. Restaurant owners can't do lunch or dinner because they're busy. They're in the restaurants. So what they started doing was very early breakfast networking events. And that went really, really well. And the extra thing they did is they did this in restaurants that had agreed to becoming champions. So then, if you were to become a champion, your restaurant was getting highlighted to the whole Chester community, being like, hey, come to our networking event there. So that really get the ball rolling and people getting excited. But also it meant that you could meet someone who had already started the transition and then ask them, restaurant owner to restaurant owner, like, how have you done this? And then at the end, when you became a champion, you would get a sticker. And that sounds like nothing, but restaurant owners were so excited, because how you get these stickers on the windows of restaurant that says, sometimes it's like the most ordered from Just Eat, or like they have these things. And it's really big, the customers see it on the door and then they're like, oh, this restaurant has this thing, I'll go in. So something as simple as just getting stickers made a big difference. And so the outcome there was really clear. They wanted to have this X amount of restaurants, and they ended up doing it, and then they could announce to the world that they had become the sustainable palm oil city. So you can always break it down that way, depending on your message and what you're trying to achieve. One thing that we have as well in the toolkit is we go through these different traps, and so there are, I think, 7 in total in the toolkit, but I'm just going to go through 3 here, and it's more to give you a bit of a taste of it. But so the first one, and it's interesting because we've talked about sharks earlier, various people were being like, sharks have really bad rep because of jaws, and it's awful, and this is exactly what this trap is about, you know. Some language has become contaminated for one reason or the other, and so when you use a word, something comes up straight away in people's mind. And so, you know, when you're saying shark, people imagine horrible things. And so sometimes it's useful to think about it in advance so that you can avoid playing into these negative associations. And so don't worry, I'm not saying that we can't use the word shark ever again. But an example here is something like human-wildlife conflict. So depending on who your audience is and what you're trying to achieve, if you want to empower people to act, instead of saying human-wildlife conflict, you might want to say that you're working on, so an example is you would say, I'm working on reducing human-wildlife conflict. Well, the flip side of that would be to say, hey, I'm working on increasing human-wildlife coexistence. It's like a simple switch, but instead of bringing straight away the negative association and having people being like, oh yeah, she's working on wildlife conflict with tigers, so it means tigers are probably eating people or they're probably eating something. If you're using the word coexistence instead, they're like, oh, okay, cool, there was something happening, but it's getting better. And so what can be quite useful as well is sometimes you have neutral ways of saying things. So for that example, it would be interactions between people and wildlife, you know, neutral. It's neither negative or positive. So our advice on this is to kind of like list the contaminated words or vocabulary that you're using in your everyday life, the things that you see people respond not quite in a way that you had anticipated, and, you know, really question whether it's worth still using these words or whether you should like change them for something different. The other trap that we've got on the list as well is the Cobra threat-heavy trap. And so, I mean, obviously I've already talked a lot about this because conservation optimism is all about this trap. But that's this idea that you want to balance threat with positive and action. And the example here that we got from our members was on penguins. So when I talked to them, I was like, okay, look, I know penguin conservation is hard. I know there's not that many positive. Penguins are hit hard. It's difficult to be optimistic. But actually, she said the way that she could think about it was instead of saying things like chin-strap penguin populations are plummeting due to climate change, she said instead we could say while this much-loved species is declining rapidly with climate change, in a certain place in the past, their largest colony has survived volcanic eruptions. And so they've shown their ability to actually bounce if we help them to do so. So, you know, she was saying, we don't know if that's going to be helpful, but they've shown us before that actually it could be not as bad as we thought. And so the action for this, again, very biased, but, you know, make a list of conservation successes you can draw on. And a very easy way is to follow the conservation optimism hashtag. You know, you'll get a regular dose of all these stories. But we also have every Monday a blog called 7 Stories of Optimism This Week. So if you need your weekly dose of optimism and positive stories as well, we have them every week. And for the past 2 weeks, we've done them specifically around the climate to match with COP as well. So there are a lot of stories out there. Sometimes it's just a case of being reminded that where to find them and, you know, just to make sure that we check them regularly so that we don't feel like it's only this doom and gloom that we see sometimes in the media. The last trap that I wanted to mention here today is the vampire bat, and it's called the typecasting trap. And so this trap is it's this idea of don't use character roles without questioning them first. And in conservation, the way I see that happen very often is with poachers or loggers, people who are destroying the environment and who can be seen as the enemy, quote unquote. And I don't know if you remember that, but a few years ago, I think about 2 years ago, there was this horrendous headline, it was everywhere, about this poacher who got killed by a lion and trampled by an elephant. And it was everywhere, and the comments on this story from people were horrendous. You know, people were like, yeah, good riddance, like, it was a poacher, awful person, deserved to die. And I was just like, you know, like, wow, like, I know we're passionate about nature, but this is a human being. This is a human being who had a family, who potentially had kids, who might have had a wife, husband. And sometimes what we forget when we play the villain cards is that we forget that there are very complex and nuanced stories to each person. So, you know, a poacher might be poaching because they don't have any other livelihood possibilities. They might be poaching because they need to put food on the table for their kids. And it's the same with like the logging, which is more in like forest ecosystem. But, you know, it's similar stories. So I would say be very careful pushing these villain stories, because what happened as well is if you're only portraying people in a certain way, you're also not really giving them a way out. And so if you want people to change and say that, you know, people might be poachers, but they can also become protector of biodiversity later on, we don't want to like trap them into these roles and just make them feel like that's what they are, and there's no way of changing that. So I would be a bit careful on that side, because that's something that we see very often. And then I just wanted to give you a bit of formatting idea as well, because I know we've talked a lot about various conservation projects happening in different places during the weekend. But you know, the great thing about science, well, conservation communication, science communication, is that you've got so much freedom and you can really make it what you want. You know, we've proven it this weekend. We have so many messages, you know, people have so much to say, and we kept saying we need young people to be heard. How do we get our voices heard? And thinking about format is a good way as well to like think of, okay, you don't necessarily need to be speaking at COP to be making a difference. You don't necessarily need to write a PhD thesis. And I know that earlier we had a session on podcasting, so it's always nice to see fellow podcasters. So at Conservation Optimism, we've got the Good Natured podcast, and basically what we do with that is we interview conservationists from a range of different experiences, and that's a great way to get access to different voices. It's a great way as well to reach a different demographic. For us, we're reaching the perfect demographic we wanted to reach according to Spotify, which is pretty much like 17 years old to 35 years old is what we're getting with the podcast. Infographics, you know, do you have complex data or complex topics that you want to bring down to an audience that may not be specialized? We found that infographics like this one, I mean, though it's longer usually, so it's a bit of an infographic, but the idea for this was to showcase that the wildlife trade is something that happens everywhere, and that it's not always negative, and that actually you can't just say, you know, let's ban all wildlife trade, because there's so much things that we need to trade. And so the idea with that is we wanted to have something very visual, so we wanted to show that it was happening everywhere, so you got all the continent represented, and we wanted to show for each continent an example that was very well known, like for example, sharks is quite known that, you know, it's cut for they're trapped. And examples that were not as well known, like the ground beetle in Europe, for example, is captured in caves, and it's for like people who have collections of them, and it's something really obscure that I had never heard of. But you know, you can then bring it to a different audience that way. Another way as well, film. You know, we had Lizzie opening the conference yesterday. I mean, it feels like it was days ago, but it was just yesterday. Films is such a powerful medium. You know, again, it's another creative way to really bring different messages. And sometimes at the festival, people say, oh, well, not all the films are about conservation. And we're like, well, for us, it's also these films about, again, as I mentioned earlier, the beauty of nature. We think that these ones are also really important. And so if we have films in there that are not about a conservation program, but are inspiring love about nature, for us, they're worth showing as well. And so that happened 2 weeks ago at the Museum of Natural History in Oxford. But the full shortlist of films is available on YouTube, both 2019 and 2020. They're both available. So, no, 2020 and 2021. If you type it on YouTube, you will find them. But again, a fantastic other format and way to spread our messages. And again, another thing that we're doing is also we're working with kids. So, you know, knowing your audience, trying to bridge the gap and making sure that we have information available for different age groups. So for this one, we've partnered with the Whitley Fund for Nature. And if you've never heard of them, they have these ceremony every year that are called the Green Oscars. So very, very prestigious prize to win. And so what we've done is we had interns, micro interns. So the University of Oxford offer this opportunity for students to help out for a week on a project. So they get a taste of like different types of jobs, different types of careers. And so our interns worked on that, and it was so great to see what they came up with that, you know, I wouldn't have necessarily come up with on my own. And so we had a quiz to know which Whitley winner you would be. We have draw-along videos that were drawn by someone who was really good creatively. And so again, tapping into different talents and different skill sets is really useful to make sure that our messages reach a wider audience. And so I'm reaching the end of the talk here. I just wanted to say it's been It's been an intense past 2 weeks with COP, and I know we've been talking about that a bit, but I wanted to share as well what's been giving me hope. I wasn't actually going to COP, so I feel like I've had a lot of FOMO and like seeing people doing things, and I was like, I'm not doing anything. But what gave me hope actually is seeing things like Seat at the Table. So that's a YouTube series that premiered during COP, and the idea with that is that they're showing people who couldn't come at COP, people who don't have a seat at the table and who are really important voices when it comes to like climate and the impact of climate. And then you also had things like, people have called this the Climate Avengers Assemble. You had an amazing group of young women, coming together in a panel with like Emma Watson. You had Greta, you had Vanessa Nakate, you had Malala, lots of amazing young women. Maya Rose as well from the UK was there. And you're just seeing that we're getting spaces where these voices can be heard is really inspiring and give me a lot of hope. And one thing that was amazing as well is Emma Watson actually gave her Instagram account to climate activists. She passed the mic throughout the entire COP. And so certainly, she has millions of followers. They would all see these stuff about climate and COP, and it was just amazing to see. And then we also had indigenous peoples, coming and really like protesting as well and having their voices heard and marching together with other organizations. And that's been super inspiring as well to see, even though they were quite upset that it wasn't amplified enough in the media. But, so make sure to like retweet it all and give them amplification as much as possible. And then I know we talked about eco-anxiety as well during the weekend, and it was great to see this campaign launched at COP called Call Your Mother. They literally had like phone booth-like things installed around Glasgow, and you can call Mother Earth and tell her how you feel, and talk about your feelings and talk about eco-anxiety, and say if you're worried, if you're angry, like no matter how you feel, you can just leave a voice note. And I think it's available online as well, so I will encourage people to check it out because it's a really cool campaign by Force of Nature, who is fully youth-led. Like their team is, I think the whole team is under 25 years old. I think they're doing amazing work. And so I quite like yesterday, I know we had a takeaway slide at some point, and I thought, yes, takeaway slide, this is great. So I think this is really the summary for me of the experience in these past 2 days. The things that I'm taking away is that there's so much power in community. Just in 2 days, we've really built that community here at Chester Zoo of young people who are passionate about the future of nature, and we can really support each other. And I know lots of people have exchanged contact details, which is great. So let's make sure to stay in touch, build these collaborations, make sure that we have that sense of community. Talking about how we feel can help, we've had this talk about eco-anxiety. It's important, and sometimes we need it. And I think it was mentioned yesterday, sometimes you just need to rest. And after COP, even though I wasn't there, I feel I need to take a step away from all the COP news and just get myself recentered a bit. Because sometimes you just can't keep going if you're faced with like a lot of quite negative news from the past few days, I would say, from the COP side. And think about your social media diet. I know it's hard and I'm not always good at it, but sometimes you can really curate your social media and try following people that inspire you, that make you feel like you can make a difference, rather than following the account that are always drumming about the doom and gloom. And sometimes just having that shift can really help you in your day-to-day just by scrolling. Instead of having the doom scroll, you can have a happy scroll instead, and that can make quite a difference. So yeah, I'm very happy that I got to be with you, and that's all for my presentation.